Would you call this a void?
What?
Void. He wants to be able to see the eye.
How do you want to mark it out? How do you want to mark it out? In terms of what? Oh, this side. Yeah, over the side. Okay. Good evening. Hello. Welcome to the first Speakers Forum event of the year. My name is Todd Burnham. I'm the president of Speakers Forum this year. And first, for some details on, can everyone hear me like this? Is this good? Yeah? Okay. In terms of the structure of the evening, first Professor Chomsky is going to speak to us, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. Depending upon how the evening goes, that's going to be up to him. He'll choose the point for that. And in terms of doing that, if people would just go up around the back and over, we only have one microphone for that, so over here on your right, if you go down to there and line up for questions. And the speech will get over approximately around 9:30, and then we'll have a reception in Tilton Hall. So, and this will all be freestyle in terms of the timing. We'll see what happens. But again, I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm really, really excited about this evening. Speakers Forum, for those of you who don't know, is a group here on campus that's run by students, and basically our agenda is to bring speakers to campus that cover topics that are of concern to students and the society at large. And we try and get people that have that are inspirational and informative on some important topics. And Professor Chomsky is definitely that. I think it's really important because this is everyone here, for the students I can speak as I think, is on a path of discovering a little bit more and more about their studies in a little more detailed manner. And I think that this journey is something that Professor Chomsky has done with great rigor in his life, and I think that that's very commendable, so I'm very glad to have him here. Professor Chomsky is the professor of linguistics at MIT. He's an internationally recognized social critic who studied relations of language and politics, and has done quite a bit in that field concerning linguistics. He's done quite a bit to reveal the injustices concerning national power and arbitrary government policies, and those of you who know of him have read about his revealing of certain documents and information concerning the policies of our government. Some of his books are Manufacturing of Consent, The Political Economy of Mass Media, Deterring Democracy, and World Orders Old and New. I think that will suffice, and I think maybe we can just all welcome Professor Noam Chomsky.
Here. Just want to get this out of the way. Can I get it over there? Yeah. These guys who really won the world are these technicians who always have you in line. Well, there's a conventional doctrine about the new era that we're entering, and the promise that it holds. It's so conventional that it's pretty much of a waste of time to give you representative quotes. It was announced again a day or two ago by the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, in a long article in the New York Times, in which he talked about the current task, which is to, in his words, consolidate the victory of democracy and free markets. This is in the article's elaboration of the so-called Clinton doctrine, which he had himself put forth. He's the intellectual in the administration. He's from around here, incidentally, which I guess is why he's so smart. The Clinton doctrine, which, as he explained it, was to move beyond containment to enlargement. That's the basic theme. Up until now, we've been containing threats to the values that we uphold: freedom, democracy, human rights, international law, free markets, and so on. And now that we've won that battle, we can go on to enlarge the domain in which we can realize our ideals. And this is accepted as virtually a truism by commentators. So, for example, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, describes here, he's not advocating, but just describing as a matter of fact, that America's victory in the Cold War was a victory for a set of political and economic principles, democracy, and the free market. At last, he says, the world is coming to understand that the free market is the wave of the future, a future for which America is both the gatekeeper and the model. And there's kind of another part of the refrain, sort of counterpoint to these themes, which is that the world is lucky to have such an angelic power to minister to its needs and wants, that we're constantly informed, for example, recently in a book by Henry Kissinger, much praised book on diplomacy, in which he explains that the United States is unique in history in its altruism and the nobility of its guiding ideals, which he considers a flaw. It's not good to do that. This crusade that we're leading all the time for democracy and free markets and international law and human rights is harmful for us, and in general we're overdoing our mission of mercy, he and many others believe. Another one who agrees with him is the well-known elder statesman George Kennan, who's one of the founders of the current world order, from one of the design architects of it from right after the Second World War. And he argues recently that it's by example, not interference, that a country such as ours can most benevolently influence world affairs. We can leave the grubbier things to other people who don't share our noble ideals, and the best thing we can do for other people is to be a good model for them. It's possible that that's the principle that underlies the fact that we have one of the most miserly aid programs in the developed world, among the industrial countries, and that would, after all, follow if the best way to help other people is to look after our own welfare. Then it would be harmful to them to give them aid the way other countries do. So that at least makes sense. Sometimes these ideas are elevated from near universal doctrine to pure logic. For that you have to go to really sophisticated places like Harvard, where they have a professorship called the Eaton Professorship of the Science of Government. And the science of government is now, the professorship is now held by a distinguished scholar, Samuel Huntington, and he tells us that the science of government teaches us that the United States is unique among nations because it is defined by its commitment to democracy, markets, human rights, and so on. And since that's a matter of definition, facts are plainly irrelevant. So it would be a pretty stupid person who would do experiments to try to demonstrate that 2 and 2 is 4. That's a matter of definition, and so is our commitment. So it's really quite unnecessary to look at facts. That makes life much easier, incidentally. I don't want to suggest that, although these views are close to universal, I mean, you really have to go way out to the margins to find somebody raising some skepticism about them. There are people, it would be misleading to say that nobody looks at facts. In fact, people do, and sometimes they even do so fairly honestly, even telling the truth. So take the matter of democracy. Some of the best mainstream work on this, highly regarded and properly regarded work, in particular on our democracy crusade of the last decade of the 1980s, is by a senior associate of the Carnegie Foundation named Thomas Carruthers, who's written a book and a number of articles on U.S. contributions to democracy, the Reagan Crusade for Democracy. And he has the advantage of writing both as from a scholarly point of view and as an insider. He was in the legal department of the Reagan State Department working on democracy enhancement programs in Central America, so he sees it from the inside as well as just looking at the results. And he points out, he says that the policies were very sincere, but they were a failure. In fact, they were a remarkably systematic failure, although he doesn't really comment on that. He gives the evidence but doesn't draw the conclusions. The failure is systematic in the sense that U.S. influence is negatively correlated with advances in democracy. That is, where U.S. influence was least, there were some advances. Particularly in the southern cone of Latin America, there were actual steps forward. That's where U.S. influence is least. And in fact, as he points out accurately, the Reaganites were very hostile to these developments and tried to block them, but they then, of course, took credit for them after they turned out to be irreversible. On the other hand, where U.S. influence was greater, like in Central America and the Caribbean, the results were pretty awful. And the reason, he says, is that the United States, I'm quoting him now, sought only limited top-down forms of democracy that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has been allied. It maintained the basic order of quite undemocratic societies, avoiding and blocking populist-based change that might upset established economic and political order and open a leftist direction. And for that reason, the sincere policies of advancing democracy were a failure. He doesn't go into saying how they avoided populist-based change, but that you're supposed to know it was with extraordinary violence and terror and lawlessness, even to the extent of contemptuously disregarding judgments of the World Court, calling on the United States to terminate its terror operations, vetoing resolutions in the Security Council, calling on all states to observe international law, blocking General Assembly resolutions, and so on. So it was through a combination of extreme lawlessness, unparalleled terror, and sadistic violence that the United States succeeded in blocking any political change and keeping quite undemocratic societies in power. And that's the area where we had some influence. Down below in the southern cone, where the influence was less, we weren't able to do that, and there was some democratic change. So the policy was a failure, pretty much in the sense that the Russians failed to achieve freedom in Eastern Europe, kind of curious failure. Well, with Carruthers and a few others like him, we move from the domain of rhetoric and ideology towards the world of reality. And in the real world, what we find is pretty much what he describes, except it's much broader. In the real world, human rights and democracy and free markets are under very serious attack in much of the world, and that includes the leading industrial democracies. To be more specific, effective power, that is the power to really make decisions that determine what goes on in the world, is concentrating more and more in almost completely unaccountable absolutist institutions, and the rich and the powerful, whose institutions they are, they're no more willing to accept market discipline or popular control than they've ever been in the past. In fact, they're now able to resist it, these dangerous tendencies, much better than in the past. Well, these are pretty large topics, and they're the ones I want to talk about, so I'll say a few words about them in order, with touching on the several topics. The easiest one to begin with, so let me start on that one, is human rights, because there at least we don't have to debate much about what it means. There is a universally accepted standard. It's codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, voted unanimously by the United Nations in December 1948, and it actually has the force of law in U.S. courts. There are also related conventions. So you can debate this and that, but there is at least a solid standard that everyone fervently adheres to. And indeed, there is a great deal of impressive rhetoric about how we stand for the principle of universality of the Universal Declaration, and we defend that principle against backward third world people who plead what they call cultural relativism. They say some aspects of it don't apply to them, but we're not going to take any of that nonsense. All of this reached a crescendo about a year ago at a conference in Vienna where the United States was very highly praised by its own press and its own intellectuals for leading the defense of the universality of the Universal Declaration and beating back the challenges from the South. I stress it was highly praised by its own press and its own intellectuals. There were also some other voices. There was a counter-conference at Vienna representing the overwhelming majority of the people of the world, organized by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, human rights groups, various social groups, and they had a big conference with all sorts of people there as a counter-conference, and it was published in a publication by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, it's Geneva-based, and since we're fortunate to live in a free country, we don't have to only read what 100% of the press and commentary was saying. We can also read the report of that counter-conference, which was published in an edition of 200 copies in Nepal. So that's the advantages of freedom. You really get everything available. It's what's called the free market of ideas. And on this, the U.S. record is very consistent. It is strongly in favor of torture, sadism, violence, and terror. That's overwhelming. In fact, there are several academic studies pointing it out. The place to look, of course, is again the place where we have most influence, which is Latin America, although it's not different elsewhere. There's the leading academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, Lars Schultz, the University of North Carolina, did a study about this around 15 years ago, right at the end of the Carter administration, and he just ran through the U.S. record. What he did actually was correlate U.S. aid with torture, and the correlation was very close, kind of close correlation you rarely get in social sciences. He pointed out in summarizing that U.S. aid tends to flow to countries that torture their citizens, to the hemisphere's most egregious violators of fundamental human rights. And that includes military aid, runs right through the Carter years, and the aid is uncorrelated with need, although it is correlated with the climate for business investment. That is, the better the climate for investment, the more the aid goes, as was pointed out in another study, this one global, not just Latin America, by Edward Herman, a colleague of mine actually, who's an economist at the University of Pennsylvania. And there's a reason, of course. I mean, aid tends to go to places that yield profit. That's what aid is. It's a technique by which the public subsidizes American investors. It's called aid. So naturally, it goes to places where they can make more money, where the investment climate improves. And it turns out that it is, in the third world, very commonly the way to improve the investment climate is to murder union organizers and torture priests and smash up peasants who are trying to form unions and so on and so forth. And so you get a secondary correlation between U.S. aid and torture. It's not that the State Department loves torture. They basically don't care one way or another. But you get this secondary correlation from what they do. So with regard to this central element of the Universal Declaration, the U.S. record is grotesque. Now, as I say, these studies were mostly at the end of the Carter years. Nobody's bothered to undertake them during the Reagan years because, it's kind of like more interesting things to do. It's too obvious. Correlation goes through the roof in the Reagan years, in fact. Well, that's anti-torture rights. Let me look at some of the more general provisions which have to do with the world order. There's a lot to say about specific provisions, but not too much time. So I'll turn to the general provisions. Maybe we can come back to it if you like, but I'll turn to the general provisions. So take, say, Article 25, which reads as follows. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, and other lack of livelihood. Well, let me just side comment. Notice this is 1948, hence the sexist language. If it was written today, you'd say it a little differently, but you get the idea. Well, it's unnecessary to comment on how that principle is upheld in the richest country in the world with absolutely unparalleled advantages, and a country in which tens of millions of people literally starve, millions of children are suffering third world conditions of malnutrition and disease. In New York City, richest city in the world, 40% of children live below the poverty line. That means deprived of minimal conditions that offer some hope of escape from misery and destitution and violence. And in fact, the United States is in the leading ranks of opposition to the Universal Declaration for the reason of this article alone. Simply to compare it with other industrial countries, the U.S. poverty level is twice as high as England. England is in second place in the race to see who can torture their own citizens more. We're considerably ahead of them and improved a lot on this, a lot of progress during the last 10 or 15 years. So that's Article 25. Let's turn to Article 23. Everyone has the right to work, to just and favorable conditions of work and protection against unemployment, with remuneration ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, supplemented if necessary by other means of social protection. Well, I won't waste any time on that one. Furthermore, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for protection of his interests. Well, let's at least talk about the last one. That one, at least, we have a formal commitment to. The other part of it, we don't even have a formal commitment to. So we don't have to bother talking about it. So let's talk about the last one. You have the right to form trade unions. Technically, that's true. Again, reality is a bit different. In reality, there's a very complex structure of laws and administrative arrangements and government practices and so on that undermines that right, which is guaranteed by the Universal Declaration. In fact, in 1992, a rather rare, I think unprecedented event, the ILO, the International Labor Organization in Geneva, which very rarely has a harsh word for its paymasters, censured the United States for its labor practices, called upon the United States to conform to international standards, which at that point were violated only among the industrial countries, only by the United States and South Africa. And with the recent changes in South Africa, I assume we've moved off to splendid isolation on that one. Illegal firings for union organizing have increased by a factor of 6 in the past 25 years, mostly in recent years. There's actually kind of an interesting article about this in Business Week, their cover story last May. Quite accurate story. Business Week reports that during the Reagan years, there were thousands of people illegally fired for attempting to organize. And they have no recourse because it's a criminal state. It's a state committed to criminal activities, and therefore the state won't prosecute. They told the employers, you want to carry out illegal activities, that's fine, we approve of it. This was part of the general advocacy of domestic crime, its counterpart to the advocacy of international crime, and it's more generally part of the big enterprise of creating a very powerful and, in fact, quite massive, expansive welfare state for the rich, grossly violating U.S. law as well as customary international law as enshrined in the Universal Declaration that we so worship. As I mentioned, that's part of a much broader pattern of lawlessness. Well, this destruction of unions is a criminal activity, as Business Week correctly points out, and is very successful, and the reason is it's supported by a criminal state. And here I'm using the term criminal in a very narrow sense. I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean in the sense of violating its own laws. It shows that, contrary to what you're taught in Sunday school, crime does pay. In particular, it pays a lot when the state and private power, the two centers of power, are dedicated to crime. In that case, it pays very well, and this is a case in point. The success of these state corporate criminal activities has many effects. You read one of them in this morning's headlines: the elimination of health care programs is directly traceable to the lack of democracy in the country. That is, to the fact that there is no way for citizens groups to organize to put forward any program. In most countries, healthcare program, we're off the spectrum on this, as you know, and it's related to the fact that we don't have unions, we don't have organized working forces. That's a little misleading to say that healthcare reform is off the agenda. Actually, what happened ends up being worse than it was before, because before all the talk about welfare stuff, there was health care reform. There were at least tax rebates for people who paid health insurance. That's off. Still there for employers, but not for people, so we have an improvement. Well, that's one of the effects of the destruction of unions. And in general, one of the main effects is that it increases the very successful attack on democracy. Unions are one of the few means by which ordinary people can sort of enter the political arena. And there's a good deal of hysteria, incidentally, when they try. If there's some time, I'll talk about it. The destruction of unions has a lot of other effects. It's, as the Labor Department has pointed out, and other researchers, the destruction of unions has been a major factor in, maybe the main factor, in lowering wages. Now, wages have sort of stagnated real wages since the 1960s, but they declined pretty sharply under the Reaganites. And in fact, by 1987, they were even starting to decline for college-educated people, which is quite unusual. In fact, again, unprecedented, apart from, like wars and things like that. Another effect, a useful effect of the destruction of unions, is that it undermines the general benefits that are guaranteed by the Universal Declaration. So like health and safety standards in the workplace, for instance. They're still there, but they're just not enforced. And they're not enforced because there's no unions around or other pressures that'll force the decision-making forces, the corporate interests in the state, to enforce them. And in fact, industrial accidents have risen very sharply over the last 10 or 15 years, as again Business Week points out. And apart from things of that kind, there's a rather important and hard to measure psychological effect. One effect of the destruction of unions is to add to the pressure to privatize aspirations, to make everything for yourself. It eliminates the sense of solidarity and sympathy and the sense that you're supposed to care for each other and so on, not just yourselves. And that's very important. This is a process that's been going on for a long time. If you go back to about 150 years ago, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and that's now right around here, Lowell and Lawrence and those places, there was a very lively working class press in those days, run by workers. A lot of women, incidentally, who were in the lead here. But this is, this is well before the Civil War. And its press was full of talk about this, because this was the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, where you're really trying to destroy human sentiments. It's important to do that. And they protested what they called the new spirit of the age, which is gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Now, in fact, they were reacting to a major campaign which was intended to eliminate human sentiments. And the reason is that they're inconsistent with private capitalism, which has to destroy human sentiments and raise private profit to the supreme human value, meaning gain wealth, forgetting all but self. And destruction of unions is, of course, a part of that. In fact, it's been a kind of an interesting transition, if you look at intellectual history, from the pre-capitalist period till today. If you look at a pre-capitalist thinker like, say, Adam Smith, who's very much quoted but never read, if you actually read him, you discover that he detested what's now called capitalism, and that he put a tremendous stress on things like sympathy and equality. He advocated markets because he argued that they would lead to perfect equality if you really had free market, the right to creative work, and so on. That's Adam Smith in a pre-capitalist period, but we've progressed over the years to a very different concept of human nature, which in fact is explained by those who invoke Adam Smith's name without shame, apparently, like a recent Nobel Prize winner, neoliberal Nobel Prize winner in economics, James Buchanan, who writes that, I'm quoting, "What each person seeks in the ideal situation is mastery over a world of slaves." In case you hadn't noticed, that's what you seek, according to prevailing ideology. It's something that somebody like Adam Smith would have regarded as totally pathological, but that's just part of his general hostility to capitalism. And it is the new spirit of the age, which is gain wealth, forgetting all but self, something that's driven into your head every time you turn on the television set, and you're sort of, you're battered with it from from early childhood on till today. Well, it's wrong to leave the issue of human rights without mention of the issue of sanctions. That's just very lively now. So let's say take say Indonesia, interesting case. One of the worst human rights violators in the world, and as you would expect, one of the major recipients of U.S. aid and support. It has a horrendous human rights record, not only at home, but even more in its near genocidal massacres that it's carrying out in its aggressive activities. And there are no sanctions. Certainly the U.S., Britain, and France are not going to talk about sanctions. On the contrary, they're participating with as much enthusiasm as they can manage to muster in these criminal atrocities on the principle that what you ought to do is gain wealth, because you do gain wealth from them. The atrocities do, in fact, contribute to wealth, like the slaughter of maybe a third of the people of Timor has contributed to the ability to rob its oil. And the right people gain wealth from that, so obviously you don't talk about sanctions. In fact, that's ridiculous since we're participating in the atrocities. However, sometimes Indonesia does something that does call for sanctions and punishment. An example occurred about a year ago. The World Health Organization had, despite extreme protest from the U.S. and its allies, the World Health Organization had approached the World Court with a request for an opinion on the legality of the use of nuclear weapons. Question, are they legal under international law? That would, of course, entail that it's not legal to have them if it's illegal to use them, which would mean you might actually have a non-proliferation treaty of a serious kind. Well, as you can imagine, the rich countries went berserk over this, and it got worse just a year ago when the non-aligned movement, 110 countries of the non-aligned movement, again, representing the overwhelming majority of the world's population, they proposed a resolution to the General Assembly, and the resolution requested that the World Court give an opinion on this issue, on the issue brought up by the World Health Organization. Well, in the face, and Indonesia happened to be the each year there's one country that's sort of speaks for the non-aligned movement. That year it happened to be Indonesia. Well, in the face of that atrocity, the guardians of international morality quickly leaped into action, and the U.S., Britain, and France threatened Indonesia with trade sanctions and termination of aid unless it withdrew this resolution, as of course it quickly did. Meanwhile, it's continuing its terror and repression with the enthusiastic support of the very same powers and indeed participation, and it's accompanied by the usual total silence on the part of respectable opinion. Facts have yet to be reported, although again it is a free society, so if you happen to subscribe, say, to the Catholic Church Press in Canada, you can learn the facts, and there's a few other places where you can learn them. You read Z Magazine, you can learn them. But in effect, it's the free marketplace of ideas working again. And of course, you do hear something, namely the usual accolades for our nobility and their support for the universality of human rights and so on. well, that's not the only place we're hearing about sanctions a lot now happens to be closer to home, namely on Haiti, and that's one that's worth looking at carefully. The regular drumbeat of commentary is that we just had to intervene because sanctions weren't working. Read that every day in the paper. I won't bother citing quotes. Well, that is not a total lie, only about 90% of a lie. After the coup that overthrew the Democratic government in September 1991, right after the coup, the Organization of American States declared sanctions, and the U.S. formally agreed to that. However, you have to stress the word formally. The U.S. also made it clear that it was not that nobody should take them seriously. It made it clear in the way that a great power can make it clear. For example, by not bothering to close the Dominican border, which takes no effort. You tell the Dominican military to close the border, and it's closed. That's the reason we invaded the country 30 years ago, to ensure that we don't have any disobedience on things like that. But that never happened. So the Dominican border remains completely open and porous somehow. We just can't figure out a way to close it. But that's a trivial part of it. Within a few weeks after the sanctions were announced, President Bush formally announced an exception to the sanctions. Namely, U.S.-owned factories in Haiti were allowed to continue their operations and trade and commerce. The New York Times did report it. They said that the Bush administration was fine-tuning the sanctions to go after the coup makers because they felt it would be better for the people of Haiti if there was at least some trade. Somehow they only are harmed, let's say people starve if other countries trade with them, but not if the U.S. does. That helps them. And in fact, if you look at the year 1990, the next year, you find that U.S. trade with Haiti, while not at the norm, was not that far below it. That was never reported. But of course, it takes a lot of work to find that out. You have to make a phone call to the Commerce Department like I did. And, after all, there's a limit on the amount of time that reporters have. So trade was approximately at the, a little below normal level the first year of the so-called sanctions. Then Clinton came in. He was going to change everything, and he did. Trade went up 50% the first year of the Clinton administration. So it's not a total lie. Actually, there's been a dramatic example of what all this meant just about a week ago, but it's still under wraps as far as I can see. Last week, everything was full of Haiti news, from Monday when from Sunday when Carter was there on. Sunday night, around midnight, the AP wires started sending stories, interesting stories, which have yet to make the press, as far as I know, and that went through the rest of the week. The stories had to do with oil shipments to Haiti. Well, anybody who'd been paying attention knew that the oil companies were continuing to supply oil. You just look at the price of oil to see that, In fact, everybody knew it. But it was supposed to not be happening because there are sanctions. Well, the AP stories, this is the most important story of last week by far, starting right before the American troops landed and then going through the week. These are leaks from a Justice Department inquiry. The Justice Department inquiry was started about a week ago. This was at the period when the Clinton administration was starting to, whip up a little enthusiasm about intervening, and the press started discovering that they kill orphans and all that kind of stuff. And part of it was an inquiry, some indication to the Justice Department that they would have a look at how come oil keeps getting in there. And they looked, and they quickly found things, and since obviously nobody's going to do anything about it, somebody leaked it to the press. And it got at least as far as the AP wires, but that's where it stopped. The stories are essentially this, that the Texaco company, the three corporations, Exxon, Shell, and Texaco, Shell and Exxon could get around it by claiming that they had subsidiaries in other countries, and those subsidiaries were sending the oil, and naturally we can't do anything about that. So what we're left with is Texaco. Texaco doesn't happen to have any subsidiaries. So within a couple of months after the sanctions were announced, they got an official cease and desist order from the executive branch, from the Bush administration, telling them to stop this criminal violation of law. However, they were also told on the side to forget it. And that went up as high as Secretary of Treasury Brady, the Secretary of Treasury in the Bush Department, who said, look, there's not going to be any prosecution. At that point, Texaco informed the Justice Department that they were going to set up a blind trust, and it's the blind trust that would be shipping the oil. The Justice Department informed them that that was illegal, but that nothing would be done about it. And that's where the issue was left, till the Clinton guys came in, and they further decided to do nothing about it. And in fact, the first time anybody even thought of doing anything about it, apparently it was about like 10 days ago or something, that's the sanctions. That's oil, central part of the sanctions. So the big story of last week, you know, big headlines, if there was a free paper in the country, would have been U.S. never imposed sanctions. The government criminally determined that it would not abide by its own law to block the shipments of oil to Haiti. Not that it's a big surprise, but since it's never been reported, it might have been useful to report it. And I assume it'll get in the press sooner or later. For one thing, a number of congressmen have been very upset about it and are calling Gonzales in Texas, particularly, who's quite good, has been threatening an inquiry. And sooner or later it'll break through, like 10 years from now or something. Somebody will know about it. So that's sanctions on Haiti. There were, of course, some kinds of sanctions, but they were targeted against the poor. And the reasons were very clear to everybody except the educated classes in the United States, and everybody in Haiti certainly understood it. The U.S. simply does not want the democratic system restored. What it wants is to get back to the situation before the election of December 1990, which was unexpected. Nobody had been paying any attention to what was going on in the poor areas of Haiti, like peasant areas, the slums, and so on. And therefore it was assumed that the U.S. would get its kind of democracy, top-down democracy, which doesn't change the structures of power. And then all of a sudden it turned out that Haiti actually had a civil society. They had a democratic tradition of a kind that we don't have. So if we want to learn some lessons in democracy, we could go there, say. But they actually had it, and they swept the candidate into office. And ever since then, the only question is, how's the U.S. going to get rid of him? Well, we're now back to the situation prior to the election. I'll go into the details later if you want, but essentially the situation is now back to prior to the election. We've managed to reverse it with the big advantage that now even the popular movements are destroyed. So we don't have to worry about that kind of problem again. Next time there's an election, we'll run it properly, and it'll come out like the election last week in Guatemala, which was won by Rios Montt, one of the really major killers of the 1980s, very strongly supported by the Reagan administration, who described him as a stellar Democrat and so on, and a guy who easily could have been a member of the Nazi general staff. He'd have had no problems. And he won with about 6% of the electorate, 19% voting. The right people, the white, rich people voted. And it's a free election. Everybody's happy. We brought democracy to Guatemala. And we'll set it up so that there's an election like that in Haiti before too long. There's a lot of things going on, but I won't proceed. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, but I want to talk about something else. So I'll go to, if you want, there's a lot more to comment about sanctions. The Cuba-China story, for example, is a very interesting one. However, let's put that aside, time being brief. Well, let's turn to back to Article 23, still on the Human Rights Declaration. Everyone has a right to work under just and favorable conditions. The ILO, the International Labor Organization in Geneva, had a big report that came out last January in which they concluded that about a third, a little under a third of the world's population is unemployed. It's a technical notion which means not enough for minimal subsistence. And they describe it as a crisis like the 1930s, except now it's global, and in fact it's much worse than the 1930s if you look. That's one crucial part of an enormous human rights catastrophe over the world. There's, according to UNESCO, about 500,000 children die every year from just debt repayment. Just that one thing, debt repayment. What's debt repayment? Debt repayment means that the banks, big commercial banks, which happen to be flooded with money for various reasons in the 70s, lent money to their favorite dictators in the third world, and now the poor people, these are bad debts, and since we don't believe in capitalism, the debts are socialized. So it's the taxpayer in the United States in one or another form who pays them off, and the poor people in the third world countries who had absolutely nothing to do with it. You know, this is our dictators borrowing from our banks. But the poor people in the poor countries and all of us have to pay these costs because, as I say, nobody believes in free market. If you make a bad debt, it's the public's responsibility. That's the system of socialism for the rich that we live under. And of course, for the people who really suffer, not you and me, just adds to our taxes a little, but the people whose children are dying every year at the rate of 500,000 a year. They're from that one thing alone. There are about 11 million children dying every year, according to the World Health Organization, from easily treatable diseases, you know, things like diarrhea, you know, like 5 cents to treat it, a little salt water or something. That's what the director of the WHO calls a silent genocide. And in fact, we wouldn't hesitate to use such a term for the death of 11 million children every year. If somebody else were responsible for it, then it would be genocide. But since we're responsible for it, we don't talk about it or hear about it. This has now spread to Eastern Europe. Since 1989, the Eastern European economies, as you know, have been in free fall. They're now back to where they were about 70 or 80 years ago. And UNESCO recently did a report on the effect of the reforms, as they're called. Reform, notice, is a very loaded word. Reforms are good things. If you're opposed to reforms, you're bad, you know. So if someone thinks like there was some other way to get out of Soviet tyranny, then you're bad. You're reactionary and opposed to reforms. So we're now talking about reforms, you know, this neutral thing. Reforms have had their effects. UNESCO estimates that in Russia their effects are about 500,000 extra deaths every year, and similar proportions elsewhere in the region. Well, that's part of the attempt to return Eastern Europe back to its third world origins, from which it tried to escape early in the century. And it's now driven back. Cold War was won, so it's now going to look like, you know, Central Africa and Brazil and other places that are properly run. In the United States, they're the same effects, but after all, it's a rich country, so it's not 500,000 deaths a year. There is, in fact, even a recovery going on, rather sluggish. It's about a half the normal rate of post-war recoveries, about a third the job growth of normal recoveries. A lot of those jobs are a very high number of them are temporaries. That's incidentally considered a good thing. It increases the flexibility of the labor market, it's called. And that's a good thing, too. Flexibility of the labor market means you don't know when you go to bed at night whether you're going to have a job tomorrow morning. And as any economist can explain to you, that's good. That's good for the health of the economy. Health of the economy is a technical notion which is defined in a very specific way in the ideological fanaticism that's called economics. Health of the economy is defined in such a way that the economy can be extremely healthy while just about everybody's starving to death. Those two things are uncorrelated. So like health of the economy has to do with things like GDP per capita, but it doesn't have to do with things like, say, the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality. And these are not, there's nothing scientific about this. These are just instruments of class war, these particular definitions of health. But if you look at the notion of health, you better learn these things like you want to get ahead in the world. You have to understand the difference between health of the economy and health of the population. As I say, they can be completely uncorrelated. They often are, in fact. Anyhow, flexibility of the labor market improves the health of the economy, as can easily be explained. Another thing that's happening is an increased workload. Well, again, you listened to this evening's news, as I did while I was driving in here, and there's a big GM strike going on because the workers are simply being squeezed to death. They're increasing workloads. In fact, working hours have now increased to the highest level since the Depression. They keep going up, and they've reached their peak. Well, that's good too. It also increases the health of the economy. It may not be very good for people, but as I say, that's a different measure. You know, all of this is part of a much broader development. It's what the Wall Street Journal about a year ago called a welcome development of transcendent importance, namely a big change from 1985 till the present U.S. labor costs per unit output, in fact wages, which were the highest in the world, as you'd expect in the richest, most privileged country, are now the lowest in the industrial world, except for England. Still ahead of, we keep racing them. In 1991, we got a little below England, but then they beat us out again, so they're still first on this race. So that's a welcome development of transcendent importance. Wages keep declining. They're now the lowest. Labor costs are the lowest in the industrial world. Working hours are going up. That has all kinds of effects, like destruction of families. You know, people are supposed to be interested in family values. Well, you know, two parents are working full time, maybe 4 jobs between the two of them, and there's no daycare because we only believe in socialism for the rich. Has a certain effect on family values, but you know that's not Dan Quayle's business. Or the Atlantic Monthly's, which thinks he's great. But these are other other aspects of this general development. Now there's a claim, you know, which again you read all the time, that all of this has to do with kind of laws of nature, you know, sort of market forces, which are kind of inexorable, you know, you just sort of live under them. And several are mentioned. One is automation, which of course drives people out of work and increases efficiency and so on, and the other is international trade, which just, you know, globalizes the economy and has all these consequences, and those are supposed to be market forces. Well, you know, if you have a look at them, you find out that both of those forces are real enough, but their relation to the market is a little dubious. So take automation, say. I mean, it's perfectly true now that automation is driving a lot of people out of work. But the reason for that is that automation technology was so inefficient that it took several decades of development in the state sector of the economy before it reached the point where it could drive people out of work. Namely, it was developed, like most technology, through the military system for decades. And it was developed, finally, after it was developed to the point where it could really harm people properly and increase profits, then it gets picked up by so-called private enterprise, and that's the market forces at work. Furthermore, the technology that was developed was of a very specific kind. It was of a kind that de-skilled workers and increased managerial power. And there's nothing inherent in the technology that says it's got to work like that. It could have worked the opposite way. So these are decisions in the state sector where most of the innovation goes on, which led to a certain form of technological development, which now indeed is kicking people out of work. But that has it's only marginally related to market forces. And the same is true of the other factor, trade. In fact, technology relates to that. One of the things that's making trade efficient, for example, is new technology like containerization, which the development of which again was so inefficient that it had to be carried out through the state sector. It was developed by the Navy for years. And after you guys paid for it with your taxes to develop it in a particular fashion, it's now being handed over to so-called private industry to drive people out of work. And there are many other forms of public subsidy that keep trade artificially efficient outside of market forces. So to take only the obvious example, the efficiency of trade depends on transport costs. But transport is very highly subsidized through the state sector. Every form of transport is state subsidized, whether it's roads or airplanes or maritime industry or whatever. Furthermore, that's only a tiny piece of it. Part of the reason why trade is inexpensive is because energy costs are kept within a certain range, not too low, because the big energy corporations, which are mostly U.S., have to make a lot of profit, but not too high, because that might cut into the efficiency of trade. And energy costs are kept that way by the Pentagon. In fact, a very substantial part of the Pentagon budget is aimed precisely at that. The main intervention forces have always been targeting the Middle East. And for years it was claimed that that's because of the Russians, but with the Russians gone, that pretext has been abandoned. You know, one nice thing about the end of the Cold War is you don't have to waste time arguing about it with a lot of lies anymore, because most of them have been abandoned as useless. And now it's officially recognized, as the White House put it right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when it was calling for its next Pentagon budget, that we need huge intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, where the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. That's nice. You know, after 50 years of lies, it now turns out that it wasn't the Kremlin that was the problem, it was the indigenous population, so we still have to keep the intervention forces, which has the advantage at least of being true. But those are some of the ways, and I'm putting aside what's called externalities, like, you know, the cost of pollution, and what happens to future generations, and that sort of thing, depletion, you know, tons of costs. If the costs of trade were ever calculated, which they're not, we don't know what the number would be, but its efficiency would be well below what it appears to be today. These are not the effects of market forces. All that aside, there's a certain kind of deception even in the notion of trade. So a large part of what's called trade isn't trade at all. In fact, not a small part. Like around 40% of what's called trade is actually internal to particular corporations. So like more than half of U.S. exports to Mexico don't enter the Mexican market. They're just shipped from some U.S. corporation here to a branch that it has across the border where they can get cheaper wages and pollute more easily and that sort of thing, and then shipped right back here. Well, you know, that's trade in the sense that it crosses a border, but it has nothing to do with the market. It's just centrally managed commercial interactions with a very visible hand and huge market distortions, because it's associated with all kind of techniques of pricing and so on to undercut market forces and protect the rich. Well, you know, over 50% is not a small number. That's a big number. And we don't know what the actual numbers are. These are the reported ones. But a huge part of trade isn't trade, and the part that is trade is not reflecting market forces. It's reflecting all kinds of state intervention. So to talk about the inexorable market forces that are leading to these things is just more deception. It's the kind of thing that you go to college to learn how to do, but you might as well be aware of what you're learning. Incidentally, this goes all the way back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution. I don't think there's a case on record of any country that's industrialized through market forces. Every single one that I've ever heard of made progress through extensive state intervention. That's certainly true of England, you know, the beginner in the racket. The British deindustrialized their colonies by force. They protected British industry from Irish woolens and, you know, Indian textiles far back as 1700. And they also did it with a lot of violence. They ended up deindustrializing both India and Ireland and indeed other colonies where they could manage it. This, I should say, was bitterly condemned by Adam Smith over 200 years ago. The United States was quite apart from that. The Industrial Revolution itself was fueled by cotton, after all. You know, Industrial Revolution took off from textiles. That's what the Lowell and Lawrence Industrial Revolution started with, just like the British. And that then spun off, you know, machines and other things. Well, how do you get textiles to be cheap? Because you keep cotton cheap. Cotton was like the oil of those days. And how do you keep cotton cheap? Well, by exterminating the native population and bringing in slaves. It's a little hard to even imagine an interference with market forces more dramatic than that. But somehow that doesn't enter into the discussion of how market forces led to the Industrial Revolution. England was made very certain as soon as it got a step up in this game that it was going to block industrialization elsewhere. So, for example, Egypt began an industrial revolution in the early part of the 19th century, about the same time the U.S. did. But in Egypt, Britain was able to block it, and they did. Egypt had its own cotton, incidentally, as India did. But England was able to block it and turn it back to a deeply impoverished society and they were pretty frank about it. They just didn't want the competition. Nothing about market forces. And that goes on. After the U.S. took over after the Second World War, it has acted in very striking ways to prevent India and Egypt, again, to develop industrially. We had the power to do it then. And this goes on everywhere. If you take a look at U.S. history, the U.S. was able to start off the Industrial Revolution behind extremely high tariff walls. Economic historians estimate that around here, you know, where it started, about 50% of U.S. manufacturing plants would have gone bankrupt immediately if they hadn't been protected, because British British textiles were so much cheaper, not through market forces. And that goes right up to the present. The steel industry was developed behind high protectionist tariffs. If you come to the modern period, you look at electronics or aeronautical industry or just about anything that functions. It has a huge state subsidy behind it, wouldn't exist otherwise, and that continues until the present day. Actually, all this increased under the Reaganites. There's kind of like a law of political science which says the more people scream about free markets, the more they violate them, something like that. I'm not sure how perfectly that works. Probably it's not as close as the correlation between aid and torture, but it's high. So nobody was more eloquent about market forces than the Reaganites, who increased the state share of GNP more radically than at any time since the Second World War. And what's more, they were proud of it when they were talking to the business community, not when they were talking to the rest of us. So James Baker, the Secretary of Treasury, boasted in a business conference that the Reaganites had increased protection for American manufacturers more than any previous American administration in the post-war era. He was being a little bit modest. It was actually more than all of them combined. They roughly doubled the percentage of U.S. imports that were subject to one or another form of tariff. A lot of talking about how the automobile company industry revitalized itself because of American know-how and so on, and also because of state pressure, non-tariff barriers, which just blocked off imports. The same was true of steel and everything else. Well, that's the Reaganites. The Clinton guys are going even beyond it. That's why they're getting a lot of business support, because they think that we ought to interfere with the free market even more radically. And in fact, in a way, they're kind of open about it. Like you may recall when last November, Clinton went to, there was this Asia-Pacific summit in Seattle, and Clinton went there and gave this dramatic speech about his vision of the free market future. I think they called it the grand vision of the free market future or some big thing, big headlines all over. And if you look, you'll notice he gave he actually picked out a corporation, which he said is the model for the free market future. The Boeing Corporation is what he picked. And in fact, he gave the speech in a hangar of the Boeing Corporation. Everyone applauded the vision of the free market. I mean, you couldn't pick an example that's more comical. The Boeing Corporation is publicly subsidized corporation. Couldn't exist otherwise. Wouldn't be the biggest exporter in the United States if taxpayers weren't paying for it. Boeing Corporation made virtually no profits before the Second World War. During the Second World War, doing its patriotic duty, it was able to rip off a lot of money, and it became quite rich. But after the Second World War, you read the business press, it was going to collapse. Everybody knew and said that the aeronautical industry can't survive in the market. So the question is what you do about it. And the answer that was hit on, in fact, for the whole economy, was pretend there's a war going on. And therefore, we'll subsidize the aeronautical industry via the Pentagon, exactly like computers and electronics and everything else. And that was done. The Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, pointed out that that the word to use is not subsidy, it's security. And that's what we've been hearing ever since. The word isn't subsidy, because that doesn't sound right. The word is security. And that's why you have the Boeing Corporation. In fact, its military component is going up again. You can't actually measure the extent of military support because of the transfer of technology, which is pretty hard to measure from military production to civilian production. But the aircraft industry, which is indeed our biggest exporter, and also a crucial part in the world's biggest industry, namely tourism, which contributes enormously to U.S. favorable balance in services, that's publicly subsidized. And it was nice that Clinton picked that example to illustrate so dramatically his commitment to the free market. And it's kind of interesting that nobody bothered to point it out, again, except way out of the margins. That's what it means to have a disciplined intellectual class. Well, a lot of rhetoric about free markets, but you have to remember that nobody believes it, except for the poor. They are to be subjected to market discipline. So the poor abroad and the poor at home, for them the market is a great thing, but not for me, please. We don't want markets for ourselves, certainly no market discipline. We want a powerful state organizing public subsidies to keep us profitable and beating down anybody who gets in our way. That's market ideology. Well, returning to the international economy and the right to work, which is in the Universal Declaration, The fact is that people's lives are being destroyed on an enormous scale. That's just true through unemployment alone, forgetting all these other things. Meanwhile, everywhere you look, you find work that these people would be delighted to do if they had a chance, and that would be highly beneficial for them and for their communities. That is beneficial to people, but not beneficial to the health of the economy. Again, remember, you have to master that distinction. All of this is a brief way of saying that the economic system is an absolutely catastrophic failure. You have a combination of badly needed work, idle hands of suffering people who would be delighted to do the work, and you have an economic system that can't bring those things together. Well, that's, almost a classical definition of catastrophic failure. Of course, this catastrophic failure is hailed as a grand success, and that makes some sense too. It is a grand success from the point of view of the health of the economy in the technical sense, and it's a grand success for a narrow sector of people, and that sector happens to include the ones who are writing the articles and giving the speeches and singing the odes to our magnificence and so on, so it all falls together rather well. Well, I don't know, there's a lot more to say about this and not a lot of time. Let me just say that there are major tendencies in the world economy that are leading to all of this. One of the tendencies, not the only one, is the internationalization of production, which everybody knows about. World economy is getting much more internationalized, and that has its effect. One effect is that power is being transferred more and more into the hands of a smaller and smaller group of transnational corporations. The numbers are mind-boggling at this point. And I have to think what a corporation is. A corporation is about as close to a totalitarian institution as humans have ever been able to devise. It's close to pure totalitarianism in its internal structure. So decision-making is top-down completely. You can be inserted into it in some level at which you take orders and hand them down. If you're outside, you can try to rent yourself to it, or you can buy what it produces, and that's it. Apart from that, it's a totalitarian institution, and huge. They dwarf states. And if you look at their interactions and the relation to banks and so on, it's a degree of concentrated totalitarian power that is beyond anything that anyone's ever dreamt of. Furthermore, it's market distorting. Seriously market distorting for the kind of reasons I indicated, the internal transactions and everything else. So it attacks democracy, and it's market distorting, and it also has the very great advantage of increasing global polarization, the gap between the poor and the rich. That's been going up pretty sharply between the rich countries and the poor countries, but even more strikingly within every country, within individual countries. In fact, it's actually faster there. We're an example. In fact, in the industrial world, we're almost in the lead. England's a little ahead of us. We're back to the levels of pre-Depression period. England's back to the levels of the Victorian period. In fact, there was actually, thanks to Thatcher, who is incidentally the most admired person among incoming college students, according to a recent poll. And that makes sense. She succeeded in driving England back to Victorian standards, as well as destroying about a quarter of British manufacturing capacity, but enriching a small sector of the wealthy. There was just a study by an old, venerable charity in England with the Queen as patron, going back to the mid-19th century and so on, which compared the nutritional levels of people on benefits, what we call welfare. That's probably 25% of children, comparing their nutritional levels with workhouses in the 1870s, kind of stuff Dickens is writing about. It turns out that they can't pay for the level of nutrition that a child had in a workhouse prison in 1870. Okay, that's good reason why she's the most popular person in the American ideological system, and why incoming college freshmen, who after all know nothing but what they're taught in the good schools, that's who goes to college, should admire this. They don't know it. It's not that they admire these consequences. They just follow the praise that's given by people who do know for these consequences. Well, the United States hasn't quite gotten that far. We're not back to 1870, but we're going that way. It's now back to pre-Depression levels of polarization. And this is an immediate consequence of the globalization of the economy, which What it means is that capital is extremely mobile and labor is extremely immobile, and that has obvious effects. There's a lot of talk about loss of jobs, but that's junk. Job loss, nobody knows what the effect of job loss is and doesn't mean anything. What it means is that you can threaten job loss. You can threaten people that if you insist on labor rights, if you insist on decent wages or reasonable working hours or benefits or enforcement of health standards, we'll move elsewhere. At which point people don't ask for them anymore, and you don't get job loss. And the economists say, look, no effect of job loss. And by their measures, there's no effect of job loss. But that's just by an ideological decision to look at certain things selected so as to ensure that you benefit the rich. You look at other things, you get quite a different picture, but devise the disciplines for their reasons as part of the university system. Incidentally, this description of highly mobile capital and highly immobile labor happens to be exactly the opposite of the assumptions on the basis of which classical economics was developed. So if you read, say, David Ricardo and so on, where you get all the nice theorems that you're supposed to memorize about comparative advantage, that's based on the assumption that capital is immobile and labor is mobile. Well, in those days, it wasn't entirely false. Labor was mobile. Like everybody could go to the United States after you exterminated the population. So labor was very mobile. On the other hand, capital was relatively immobile. Capital meant mostly land. You can't move it. And if there was manufacturing investment, there was no way to put it in some other country. So it was sort of true. Capital was immobile and labor was mobile, and from that you can deduce all the theorems. Now the situation is exactly reversed, and you just learn the theorems because they're useful as ideological weapons, even though exactly the opposite assumptions are true. Another advantage of corporations, of course, is they operate in secret. They're deeply undemocratic. You don't know what goes on inside these totalitarian institutions, nor do you know what goes on in the network of quasi-governing structures that they're spawning, like the IMF and the World Bank and so on. And indeed, this is the reason why classical liberals were so opposed to corporations, in our sense, like Thomas Jefferson, who lived long enough to see the early stages of the corporate system and wrote in his last years that banking institutions and moneyed-in corporations, what we call corporations, would simply destroy liberty and would restore the absolutism that the American Revolution fought against. He couldn't dream of how far it would go. At an earlier stage, half a century earlier, Adam Smith, who couldn't even see corporations in our sense, this is pre-capitalist, but he could envisage it, and he also warned against joint stock companies, corporations, and their potential power in market distortion and so on, which he said was very dangerous. In particular, it would become dangerous, he said, if they were granted the rights of persons, indeed immortal persons. And that happened in the 19th century. It didn't happen through parliaments, like Congress never voted on it. This was done by courts and lawyers and corporate representatives and lobbyists and so on. It was basically through judicial designs, and it created a form of absolutism that's way beyond Jefferson's worst nightmares, and the move to transnational economy just extends this even further. The end of the Cold War just contributes to it. It means there's a new third world labor force that you can use as a weapon to beat what the business press calls the pampered European workers. You can beat them over the head with the idea that you can move across the border where you'll get ample protection, high tariffs, and so on. And that way you can get the Western workers, the pampered Western workers, to cut down on what Business Week calls their luxurious lifestyles. Meanwhile, profits are just zooming. You read the Fortune, every year the Fortune magazine runs its Fortune 500 thing, and take a look at this year's. They're just in awe of what they call the dazzling profits. Even though sales are stagnating, it's not that there's growth, it's just that profits are dazzling while wages are going down. Well, that's what the system is designed for, not because of the laws of nature, but because of conscious human decisions and institutions. The so-called trade agreements just extend that. Well, just to end, there's a kind of an interesting resemblance, almost eerie resemblance, I think, between the current period and the very early days of the Industrial Revolution. Now, then it was just England. Now it's the world. But if you look back to what was happening then, it has some similarities to what's happening now, and it may be instructive. This is the period, incidentally, like the 1820s. It's the period when the economic principles that you're supposed to revere were created, what's now called neoliberalism or classical economics. All this stuff was basically developed then, by people like Ricardo and Malthus and so on. And there was a purpose to that. There's something very definite that was going on. It was extremely important to break down pre-capitalist social arrangements and pre-capitalist cultural conditions and psychological conditions. All that had to be destroyed. Crucial, and it was a crucial part of it. It was what was called, in fact, the right to live. In feudal society, people had a right to live. They had a place in the society. Feudal society kind of organized everybody with a place. For most people, it was a pretty rotten place, but it was some place. And they had a right to live in that place. Well, that's inconsistent with capitalism. Capitalism does not grant a right to live, just as it doesn't grant any other human rights. In fact, it denies them. It's inconsistent with them. And the main thing that people like Ricardo and Malthus and the rest of them were trying to do was to demonstrate that there is no right to live. As they put it, if you don't have independent wealth and you can't survive in the labor market, which is where you get your rights, then go somewhere else. Okay? That was the message. Ricardo explained that you deceive the poor, I'm quoting, if you make them believe that they have other rights, just like you deceive mothers on welfare if you let them think that their children have a right to milk. That's deception, It's a violation of natural liberty and a great evil, he said. It only harms the poor if you attempt to help them. And furthermore, this is true with the certainty of the principles of gravitation, Ricardo explained. You have no right, human beings have no intrinsic rights, that's crucial. They have the rights you can get on the labor market, unless you have independent wealth or something. And the choices are labor market, workhouse prison, or go somewhere else. That's it. Well, by the 1830s, and that meant breaking down the welfare system and, the whole set of arrangements and beliefs that went along with it. These things I quoted from the United States, from the local labor press, are examples of this here. Well, by the 1830s, the science, as it was called, had been enshrined in the law, and they got what they wanted, but there were some problems. One of the problems was that the British Army was spending most of its time putting down riots, because somehow it's pretty hard to knock out of people's heads this odd idea that they had the right to live. I mean, they understood it, I could follow the logic, but somehow it didn't resonate, So what they did was riot. And then they did something even worse. They started to organize. You get Chartism and the labor movement, and pretty soon you got a challenge to the right to rule. All right, now it's serious. We don't want that. Well, the science happens to be very flexible. It's not like physics. You can adapt it very easily. So the science began to change, and it turned out that actually people did have a right to live. The same scientists discovered that you do have a right to live, and by the time you get to around 1850 and you get to, say, John Stuart Mill and his Principles of Political Economy, the science is talking about what's sort of the foundations of the welfare state, And from that point on, laissez-faire is actually a bad word. Other things were happening, too. The rich already got what they wanted, and they knew they needed a powerful state to defend their interests, so there wasn't too much resistance to this. So the science changed, and it moved in response mostly to popular uproar, and then you go off to a welfare state period, and the rest. We're now, last 10 or 20 years, we're going back to the 1830s. It was as if this was like an interlude, and except now it's global. So now there's a global experiment going on, which has some similarity to what was happening in England in the 20s, I think. The idea is that production globally should be by the super-exploited, and people in the rich countries will be driven down to that level. They need not lose their jobs. They just have to lose their rights. That's all that's required. So you have production by super-exploited, wages go down, living standards go down, everything goes down except profits. They go up, so you go like that. You move towards a kind of international third world, two-tiered societies, small sector of very wealthy big group of very rich. Production by the super exploited. Market is worldwide now, so it's the rich in the world. And they're a pretty large sector. Like in a rich country like, say, the United States or something, they're a fairly substantial sector of people who can be part of the market system. In a poor country like, say, Brazil, it's a smaller sector, much smaller. In fact, you go to sub-Saharan Africa, they're very rich people in sub-Saharan Africa, but really small number. So the idea is, and that's what's happening in Russia, like, say, maybe 5–10% of the population is doing great on the reforms, which is why we're lauding them, and most of the people are the kind of thing you read about in the UNESCO report, but we don't care much about them or as to their counterparts elsewhere. In fact, the point of the Cold War was to drive them back to that level, and that was the victory. So what you have is production by the exploited for the wealthy, and then there's a side problem. You have a huge mass of superfluous people. That's the typical third world model. There's an awful lot of superfluous people. They don't contribute to profit making, and therefore they have no rights, but they're there. So what do you do with them? Well, like if it's Brazil, which we've incidentally been running for 50 years, so what's going on in Brazil is what we determine. If it's Brazil, what you do is you send out the security forces to murder them. So you send out the security forces to kill street children and that sort of thing. Now, you can't quite do that in the United States, at least yet. So because we're a rich, advanced country, so it's done differently. What you do is either lock them up in urban slums, which are kind of concentration camps, and hope that they kill each other, or you put them in jails. And that's exactly why the prison population is booming. It's like it's a corollary to this. 2 years ago, the United States had reached the highest per capita prison population in the world. Unfortunately, we're still going up, but somebody passed us, namely Russia. We've now driven them to capitalism, so they're, in fact, even ahead of us in prison population per capita, it turns out. But we'll catch up again, because we lead this thing. So, and that, incidentally, is also a Keynesian stimulus to the economy, like a lot of construction and, cheating by contractors and politicians, and a lot of work, too, a lot of service work for guards and stuff. So it makes its contribution to the health of the economy, and it also helps take care of the population. In fact, if you look at the statistics, the crime industry, which is what it is, targets the most defenseless part of the population. So if you have a look, there's some interesting studies of this here. They basically target black males. Wealthier people, especially white wealthier people who are carrying out the very same crimes, are not targeted. And it's dramatic. It's really dramatic, and that makes sense too, because after all, you just like the Brazilian cops kill the street children, they don't kill the children of rich people, and it's the same reason. You go after vulnerable people. That's our system of values. You go after vulnerable, defenseless people. That's, of course, what you do if you're going to try to gain wealth, forgetting all but self, our guiding value. Also, as part of this, you have to instill hatred and fear and so on, and it's a very frightened country. For example, there's a belief around the country that crime is just zooming up and it's a real danger. It's about where it was 25 or 30 years ago. Nothing much has changed, except for very poor people for whom it is worse. But for most people like us, let's say, there's no change in crime, at least no statistically detectable change of any significance over the last 20 or 30 years, but there are big differences in the beliefs. And that's the result of a major propaganda effort trying to frighten people. Nothing new. Like the Nazis did the same thing. They created a very frightened population. That's the way you mobilize people when you're really stomping on them. You get them to hate each other and be afraid and so on. No real innovations here. That makes sense. It's, again, similar to, earlier periods. And going back to the 1820s and 30s, the question is, will there be the same kind of response? Well, this is a lot harder now. In a small national economy like England, you could have a kind of response which is extremely hard to develop on a global scale. For capital, it's very easy. Concentrated, powerful, a lot of communication, can move here and there. For people, it's a lot harder. And nobody knows the answer to this. Can it work? Can you have a world society in which which is extremely polarized and increasingly polarized, with production by the increasingly exploited for the increasingly wealthy, and a mass of people either taken care of by death squads or by prisons or by some other device. Will that work, or will there be the kind of resistance, popular resistance and organization, as there was finally in early England, which forces changes in these developments? Well, you know, that's the kind of thing you can't really predict. All you can do is see the tendencies. These are matters of actual decision, you know, not prediction. They'll be predicted. Okay. Finished. Okay. Sure. Yeah, we'll have questions now. I can't see people way in the back because of the lights. So there's. Oh yeah, there's a microphone. So if people could just come to the microphone if they want to say anything, make life easier. Yeah. Somebody there? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. There was a report recently on an IMF World Bank plan for Haiti, which Aristide approved. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to read about it, it's not quite as bad as the Women's International League publication in Kathmandu, but it's a little more available. But there's a journal called Multinational Monitor. And in it, in the summer issue, there's an article by one of the really good reporters, one of the very few reporters who really does his homework, Alan Nairn, who's been doing really good stuff on Latin America for years. And he managed to get the World Bank report. In a sense, Aristide approved of it, but, you know, he approved of it the same way you'd approve of something if, you know, you had some guy, you know, with a gun at your head, you know, giving you water torture or something. So he approved of it. Not that he had a choice. The World Bank. This is well. The press is now beginning to describe it. They describe it as Aristide's program. You know, given to the Paris Club, the rich lenders, by his economists. That's total fraud. It's a World Bank program, meaning a U.S. program, imposed upon Aristide. And if you look at it, it's a standard structural adjustment package, except the World Bank official who is in charge said it won't be as harsh in Haiti as in other countries. World structural adjustment packages say all resources have to go to rich investors, foreign investors, the domestic rich, and so on. You got to eliminate social services, in fact, eliminate everything for the poor, like you want to privatize services. That's extremely important in poor countries. Actually, not only Haiti. Like, I have a daughter who lives in Nicaragua, and I kind of watch this happening. There's a lot of pressure on Nicaragua to privatize services, like, say, water. And that's extremely important, because if you can privatize services, it means most people die, you know, since they're kind of able to survive because things like water are sort of provided. But if you can get as much water, if you really eliminate the right to live, you know, and you can get as much water for your children as you can get on the labor market, they'll die. You know, so it's important to privatize services, and that's what they're doing. So you the reason the World Bank official said it won't be so harmful in Haiti is he said they don't have a lot of services anyway, so they won't suffer as much as most countries. So it's not really bad, you know. So the idea is you privatize, that is, eliminate, except for the rich, just about everything there is, except the resources will flow to the export sector. Which means foreign investors and the big rich families that back the coup and so on. That's the World Bank program. It's called very progressive. In fact, the way it's kind of interesting to see the way it's described in the press by the big thinkers like Elaine Sciolino of the New York Times, who tell us that it's been really difficult dealing with Aristide. If you've been following this stuff, you've got to have noticed how incredibly racist it all is. I mean, just mind-boggling, you know. But they've got this kind of erratic, you know, black, kind of stupid theologian who doesn't understand anything and is anti-American to boot. but they've been, as Elaine Cellino put it, they've been giving him a heavy dose of economics. Okay, they've been teaching him, the way things really are, like he didn't have time to go to Clark, so they're teaching him rapid dose of economics, and he's now understanding that the real world, the way it works is all public resources go to the rich. The poor, if they can survive in the labor market, fine, otherwise they die. That's economics in a nutshell. And you can sort of spell it out in a lot of formulas. But and that's what the World Bank program is. You have a look at the details. It's in print. So you can. I don't know if the library gets the journal, but if they don't, they ought to. It's a good journal. It's Multinational Monitor, the July-August issue. Alan Nairn has a long report on it. And as I say, it is being alluded to in the press, but in a highly misleading fashion. Yeah.
The first is some of the historical questions.
Can't hear. Could you move up a little?
I'm sorry. If you could talk a little bit about some of the origins of our current political system, that being the offering of extradition to thousands of the Nazi aerospace technicians, including a lot of other medical personnel and other military leaders, numbers ranging between estimated 5,000 and 10,000 people, and there were vast number that were also being taken in Latin America. And it seems that, particularly in Latin America, there's terrorist operations that parallel the properties of what we saw with the Nazis implemented. So often in your writing, you talk about that, and it seems it's not just like the Nazis, it particularly was or is.
Yeah. I mean, there's actually a direct connection. I mean, I think we would have done the same thing without any Nazis, but the fact is there's a direct connection. How important it is, you can judge, but one of the main tasks of the U.S. forces, as they did what was called liberating Europe, was to essentially restore the fascist order and undermine the resistance. Actually, that was a worldwide project. If there was such a thing as a history of the post-war world, you'll wait a long time for that. It's post-Second World War. Its first chapter would be on the global effort to destroy the anti-fascist resistance and to restore the fascist structures. Not necessarily with every single leader, like you didn't want Himmler back in there, but you wanted the important people. I mean, all the people who funded him and organized it and ran it and so on. They're called the moderates, the ones who kind of try to benefit from the system and participate in it, but don't actually push somebody into a gas chamber. They're the moderates. Same thing in Haiti, incidentally. It's on a much smaller scale. So you had to get back the moderates, the fascist system, and you had to destroy the resistance. The reason is the resistance had all kind of crazy ideas. They were interested in things that were called radical democracy. Like, for example, when it started in Italy, which has been the target of more CIA operations since then than the rest of the world combined, probably, but certainly most. In Italy, there was a real resistance. It had held down 6 German divisions, and it had liberated most of northern Italy before the liberators got there. And they had set up popular committees, and they had taken over factories, and they were rebuilding the economy, and they were doing some really bad things. It was the British Labour Party, incidentally. The British Labour Party and us, the Roosevelt Democrats, were appalled by what they found, particularly because they were doing things like hiring excess workers and carrying out arbitrary dismissal of bosses, most of them fascists. So they were arbitrarily dismissing fascists and hiring excess workers, meaning, and I don't have to translate what that means, but anyway, that's not allowed. So the U.S. went in, disbanded the resistance, stuck the old bosses back in power, stopped the hiring of excess workers. Incidentally, these same reports, which are now all declassified, say, yeah, hunger is the worst problem in Italy, but hunger is their problem, not our problem. Our problem is to make sure that the old fascist order gets restored. Then they can take care of the hunger. So it starts off from there, and it was the same all over the world. Sometimes very brutal, like in Korea, for example, the American occupation in South Korea killed about 100,000 people before what we call the Korean War. You know, we call the Korean War 1950, but it started in 1945, and then it was mostly killing the anti-fascist resistance and restoring the collaborators and even using the Japanese police, incidentally. And the same thing, it's true worldwide, there's not an exception to it as far as I know. Well, one aspect of this was saving the people you couldn't keep there. So like take, say, Klaus Barbie, famous. When he, you know, the butcher of Lyon, big Nazi killer, when the American forces moved in, the first thing they did was simply restore him to his old job. And in fact, when he was later, you know, a couple of years ago, he was picked up and there was a big scandal about it. His commanding officer in U.S. intelligence actually had an interesting letter in the Times. He didn't identify himself, but I checked it out, and he was his commanding officer in intelligence. He said, look, it's crazy to criticize U.S. forces for this. Klaus Barbie was a specialist in going after the resistance, and that's what we needed, because we were going after the same people. So why shouldn't we go after the, like we're taking over where the Nazis left off, so why shouldn't we use the people who know how to do it? This is stupid, you know. Well, okay, Klaus Barbie was restored to his job, but there came a point when they just couldn't keep him on, you know, it was too much of a killer. So he was spirited out of Europe through a network. It was called the Rat Line, which involved the Vatican and all sorts of Nazi priests in Croatia and so on. And they got him off to Latin America. He ended up in Bolivia, where indeed he was involved in narco-trafficking and military coups as late as 1980, and that the U.S. was involved in, and so on. So there's a direct connection. Actually, the most extreme case was Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of, under the Nazis, was the head of Eastern European operations, meaning, and you know what that means. That's the huge massacres, I mean, of everybody, Jews, Slavs, everyone. That was his job. And he was picked up right off, very fast, and reestablished as the central part of U.S. intelligence dealing with Eastern Europe. And again, for obvious reasons, he sort of knew the ropes, you know, knew the job, knew who would go after, and so on. And in fact, this is all run out of George Kennan's office in the State Department. This is all well known. There's good books about it, and a lot of documentation and stuff. Very straight books. I mean, this is not marginal. You know, mainstream books now talk about these things. And one of his jobs, for example, was to support armies that Hitler had established in, you know, the Ukraine and places like that. And he was supposed to be supporting them and organizing them. And in fact, there were airdrops and CIA actions and so on up till the early 50s. The only reason they stopped is because it turned out that the Russians had everything penetrated. And everything was being exposed, and every time they had an airdrop, they just picked up more guys involved with CIA and so on, so they finally called it off. Supposedly, nobody knows, but supposedly it stopped in the early 50s. Another aspect of this was simply bringing Nazi war criminals to the United States. A lot of them were scientists, and that part is known, but less known is a more interesting aspect. They brought counterinsurgency specialists, guys from the Wehrmacht and the SS, who were engaged in anti-partisan activities. And they were brought over and involved with the U.S. Army, who was then trying to work out counterinsurgency doctrines, what later became counterinsurgency and low-intensity conflict. And if you look at the history of this, it begins with U.S. Army studies, they're now declassified, involving Wehrmacht and SS officers, studying how the Nazis tried to put down the partisan resistance in Europe and where it succeeded and where it failed and what lessons you can gain from it and so on. And it's written, they're all written from the point of view of the Nazis. So the partisans are the terrorists, you know, and the Nazis are defending order and so on. You know, all the stuff you read about and everything you read about Central America. And they designed the techniques, and they became counterinsurgency literature. Actually, if you want to have a look at this, there's quite a good book about it by a guy named Michael McClintock, who was a researcher for Amnesty International for years, and then took off, and he wrote a book called, he's written several books, but this one's called Instruments of Statecraft. It was published by Pantheon a couple of years ago, and he has a lot of details about this stuff. I've reviewed it and some stuff I've written too, but he has a lot more details. So there are these various strains. They all make complete sense. I should say there isn't much of a gap. And if you do an honest history, the gap is a few years. The U.S. was very pro-Mussolini. He was that admirable Italian gentleman, as President Roosevelt called him. They kept supporting him into the late 30s. The U.S. was pro-Hitler. The British were even more pro-Hitler, I should say. This goes on into the late 30s in the United States. Late 30s, the European branch of the State Department is sending back reports saying we have to support Hitler and other fascists because they're the only barrier to popular forces taking over against the labor movement and so on, which might, take over unless somebody is a barrier to this atrocity, and it's just the fascists. Hitler was a moderate, standing between the extremists of right and left, just like Duarte and El Salvador. I mean, the stuff is just, goes on. And as far as the British were concerned, I mean, it's amazing, but even after the Battle of Britain, like when the Nazis were bombing London, they were still kind of supporting the Nazis. Their objection, they actually support them, but their objection to the Hitler-Stalin Pact was that it gave Stalin too much power. That's as late as 1941 in British Foreign Office records, which are now out. So Hitler was like a secondary problem, even when he was bombing London. And the reason is, look, it's basically a class war, and they understood this. And they were on the side of the class that happened to be supporting the Nazis and the fascists, and they restored them. They started restoring them very soon. The first place that was liberated was actually North Africa. And there, Roosevelt put in... This is late 1942, he put in Admiral Darlan, who was one of the leading Vichy fascists. In fact, the author of Vichy's anti-Semitic laws. He was put in charge. Then when they started liberating southern Italy, same story. I mean, first of all, they reinstated the mafia for control, but also they just began reconstituting the traditional conservative order, which meant mostly fascist sympathizers. Who else? It's exactly, look, it's just a foretaste of what you're going to see the next couple of months in Haiti, You want to predict what's going to happen, just take a look at history. It happens all the time. And it happens for very good reasons, because that's the way you satisfy the primary value of gain wealth, forgetting all but self. It's a perfectly rational way to proceed. And every aspect of this, including, getting Klaus Barbie out to Bolivia and everything else, that's just one aspect of it. It happens with very great consistency because it flows from institutional sources. And another thing that flows from institutional sources is what goes on in what, if we were honest, we would call the commissar culture. That is the general intellectual culture, which has a hard problem. It has to put a kind of a benevolent cast on all of this. It takes a lot of discipline and a lot of education before people are able to do that well. You have to internalize the techniques for not seeing what's in front of your eyes. And it takes many years of schooling at good colleges and so on and so forth before you get that part enough of your nature so it comes reflexively. It's not simple, because if you look at what's in front of your eyes, it's, nothing you're going to tolerate. And that's a large part of what education's about, in fact. But the things you mentioned, I think they sort of fall within this.
Actually, the second question is to keep a little interesting people to think about what it would mean to start an encouragement of critical dialogue and investigation and even government action to deal with this stuff current today. I mean, that's everything. Because frankly, in my world, in Institution of Clark, we're not invited or so they're not encouraged to study this. I mean, I had to take directed readings and luckily I, knew authors like NoamChomsky, and I could just look at it myself. But the rest of it, we're force-fed conventional theorems, and that's what we're supposed to do, is obey. And just thought maybe you can talk about how we can make a challenge.
You know that better than I do. There's nothing for me to tell you. I mean, for example, students have done lots of things over the years on their own initiative, often very effective. I mean, the whole society just changed radically over the last 30 years, and an awful lot of it is just student initiatives from the 1960s that just spread around the rest of the country. I mean, I was, associated with students who were doing it, but it's nothing that you don't know how to do. I mean, you have to start by, there's no secrets, It's like the civil rights movement. It's like everything else. It starts with just getting your head more or less clear, being involved in organizing activities so you and other people can help each other, and then getting to a scale where you can begin to have some effect and bringing in others and so on. I mean, it's education and organizing and activism of various kinds, and what you do depends on the issue. So there's no general formula. People ask me this all the time, and there's never anything to say, because it's all sort of obvious. I mean, there are no secrets. Like there was no secret as to how, say, SNCC back in the 60s ought to try to break through these horrendous laws in the South. They just did it, If you thought about it, it was obvious how to do it. The question is, do you have the courage to do it? If they had the courage, and they did it. They didn't need any lessons, and nobody was around to give them any lessons. Yeah.
Two questions related. Can you comment on what you see as the reason for the planned invasion of Haiti? Because I have a lot of...
For the...
Planned invasion.
What the U.S. did, as soon as the Aristide government came in, it was a big surprise, remember. Nobody expected that election. The U.S. had a candidate. He was a World Bank official. They figured he'll sweep over everything. Because he had all the resources and all the rich people backed him, and as far as they knew, there was nothing else. Who pays attention to what's going on in the slums? So they figured it'll be a walkover like everything else. And to their amazement, there was this vibrant, lively civil society out there which managed to get a presidential candidate in. Incidentally, they weren't organized enough and rich enough to get parliamentary candidates in. So that's why you read the commentary now about how Aristide is this kind of impossible guy who can't deal with the parliament. Yeah, sure, because the parliament is the old guys who we put in power forever, the rich killers and so on. That's a little subtext. But they did manage to get a presidential candidate in. So the U.S. began at once trying to undermine him. At once. Then wait a minute. Like there's been a lot of... The U.S. has a picture of what Haiti ought to be. It ought to be basically an export platform for, assembly plants using super cheap labor, and there's been a whole project about this. USAID had been pouring money in for that, and they called it an economic miracle, and it was. I mean, wages went down about 50% and profits went up about as fast. That's what an economic miracle is. This was all blocked by this election, so USAID did continue, but it was stopped. They stopped any aid for investment. Any constructive aid stopped, because they weren't going to make any profit out of it. The aid simply went to the business community to enable them to set up counterforces to the popular movement. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is a bipartisan thing, went in, and any reader of Orwell knows what a National Endowment for Democracy is going to be, and it is. They moved in to try to set up alternative things that would weaken the executive, so alternative groups that would try to undercut the popular organizations. And by one of those strange coincidences, these groups are exactly the ones that survived the coup, while the others were destroyed, and they then filled the offices after the coup. The 7 months that Aristide was in office were very frightening. I mean, not only was it a popular movement that pushed him in, but he was also being extremely successful. I mean, he even successful by conservative World Bank standards. So like the Inter-American Development Bank, which is not a radical outfit, was writing very positive reports of cutting down the bureaucracy and, getting rid of corruption and starting a functioning economy again and so on. And that's even worse, because he started getting international funding, which means the place might fall out of U.S. control, which is totally unacceptable. So this guy obviously had to go. Really bad news. And the only question was how. Okay, there was the coup. Right after the coup, as I mentioned, the U.S. essentially supported. I don't say they planned the coup. Maybe they did or maybe they didn't. But they acted at once to ensure that it stayed in. So they undercut the embargo. I talked about that. Meanwhile, they're sort of standing by while their guys... We talk about professionalizing the security forces. Who professionalized them in the first place? They were set up by the United States when we invaded the country before as an army to repress the population. Ever since then, the top officer corps has been trained by the United States, including the guys who are doing the killing right now. They're all trained in Fort Benning and the School of the Americas and so on. In fact, Haitian officers were seen. There's a church group that monitors Fort Benning, School of the Americas, and according to them, there have been Haitian officers there as recently as 11 months ago, right in the middle of all the atrocities. So they're going to be professionalized by the same guys who taught them in the first place. and they'll teach him how to do it a little better next time. Aristide wanted the army to be reduced, and the U.S. blocked that. That's been one of the things that held up negotiations. Actually, you can read about that in an article in Foreign Policy, one of the main foreign policy journals, by Ian Martin, who was the head of the UN OAS mission, who points out that, you know, what was holding things up was that the U.S. insisted on maintaining the military, while the other countries, Canada and France and so on, were trying to support Aristide's effort to cut it back. And the army leaders wanted the United States to take control because they trusted the United States to work for their interests. They didn't trust Canada and France and the other guys as much. And that's going to happen. So the army stays in. The economy is going to be driven away from the populist reforms, back towards, you know, the pre-1990 system. Aristide may be allowed in for cosmetic reasons. A centerpiece of Clinton's speech the other night, if you heard it, you know, when he was sort of trying to build up some steam for the invasion, one of the rhetorical centerpieces of it was his statement that, you know, Aristide has shown himself to be a true Democrat. Namely, he has committed himself to step down in 1995, you know, and not to run again for office as the Constitution demands. And that, as far as I can see, there has not been a whisper of comment about that in the American press. The obvious has been pointed out in the Canadian press. The obvious is that the Constitution does say that he's got a 5-year term, but it doesn't say what happens if 3 years of that 5-year term are spent in Washington while the guys who were trained by the United States are decimating your popular support. It doesn't say anything about that. So you can interpret it in two ways. If you really have a passionate hatred for democracy, you'll interpret it as meaning he goes after the 5 years. If you believe in democracy, you'll say when he gets back in, if ever, he'll pick up where he left off and finish up the 5-year term. But I can't find anyone, any commentator in the United States yet, whose hatred of democracy is so limited that they can even see this point, you know. So he's out. You know, he'll come back, and I presume they'll try to get him back in a couple of months. Aid will start in maybe 6 months or so. That's what they're saying now. It'll go to the business sectors, meaning he can't do anything for his constituency. They're intimidated and decimated. Then you'll be able to then he's going to leave very quickly. You can then run a free election, and we have a lot of experience with that. I mentioned the one in Guatemala. You know, there are a lot of others like it. We'll run a free election. Everybody's scared out of their wits. They vote the way you tell them to if they bother to vote at all. And they know that if you don't, you know, your children are going to get cut in pieces and left in a ditch. So therefore you vote the right way. And then, you know, the press here writes about it's a romantic age, you know, Thomas Jefferson's back, and so on and so forth. You can write the scenario right now, you know, because we've been through it so many times, you know. We've been through it over and over again. It's exceptionless. Occasionally something goes wrong, like there actually is a free election by mistake, like in Haiti, and then you quickly act to make sure that's not going to happen again. That's history. You know, it's got nothing to do with the Cold War. It went on before the Cold War. It's going on after the Cold War. The only effect of the Cold War is to change the pretext, you know, so you shift the rhetoric around a little. And it happens for very good reasons. That's what's been happening in Haiti, and I think there's every reason to think that's what's going to happen if we let it happen. We don't have to agree to this. You know, it's like it's not laws of nature. These are human decisions made within human institutions. They can change. But they're not going to change any more than we're going to have a health care program or anything else unless there's big popular pressures about it. Otherwise, it's not going to change, because there's no reason why the people who are making decisions should make different decisions. They're making the decisions which maximize their own wealth and power. And it's ridiculous to think that they should make any other decisions. It's like asking a chairman of the board of General Motors to try to lose money. You know, you don't appeal to him to try to cut down profits. That would be ridiculous. There's an institutional, Milton Friedman is right about this. It's his job to maximize profits and market share. There's no point appealing to him to do anything else. That's crazy. If he decides to do anything else, somebody else comes in and does that, because it's an institutional fact. You have to change the institutions, or at least put them under enough pressure so they act in a different way. And that's not simple, but it's possible. It's happened on a lot of things. The invasion was just